Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I wanted to talk to you about warm-ups for runners. Now, a lot of patients will ask me about this, what they should be doing as their warm-up pre-run, whether they should be doing static stretches, dynamic stretches, etc. So I thought it was a good topic for us to talk about. Things that you can include in a warm-up, how that might link to some of your rehab goals, but also being realistic about a warm-up and what it's likely to achieve. I've also put a link there to our running resources page where you'll find a great free webinar series on lateral hip pain. Highly recommend checking that out. So let's start by talking about what a warm-up for runners is likely to achieve and what it probably isn't quite so likely to achieve for us. Now, I do think a warm-up is a useful thing to do. There is some evidence that it can actually improve running economy, and we'll talk particularly about how we might achieve that shortly. And it helps prepare us for running, it helps us feel more comfortable, particularly if you're working with an athlete who's been sat all day, hasn't really moved around much. It doesn't feel great to get up and go straight out for a run, particularly an intense run. So it can help prepare us for our sport, help us feel more comfortable, possibly improve our running economy. But what it doesn't seem to do, at least according to the research, is a warm-up doesn't seem to reduce risk of running injuries. Now, I will say there's not a great deal of research in this. When I was looking at the evidence, I found really one main study going back into 1993 by Van Mechelen et al. Now, they took around 320 runners and they got them to do a warm-up that included some running exercises, some loosening work and some stretches. And they included similar things within a cool down as well. And actually, they found that this structured warm-up didn't reduce running injury incidents at all. And actually, I think that's part of the problem with the warm-up. They're not especially effective in reducing injuries because in many situations we see that running injuries are more linked to excessive load during running. So you could do the best warm-up in the world, but if you go and run 10 miles when your body's only ready to do 5, that warm-up isn't really going to be enough to prevent injury. So I think we can include them, but just be aware that even the best warm-up you can do is not going to bulletproof your athletes against injury. They still need to think about their load management, plan their training, plan their recovery to reduce their overall injury risk. And of course, why not include a warm-up with that, but just know what its limitations are. Now, there is some evidence outside of running that structured warm-ups perhaps can be effective in reducing injury incidents, particularly the FIFA 11 Plus. But this is quite an extensive warm-up that involves a mixture of balance work, plyometrics, strength work, pair work. I believe it takes around about 20 minutes or so, and it's just not really been studied in runners yet. So perhaps there will be something we'll see in the future that's a bit more effective, but the evidence at the moment really doesn't support warm-up as a great injury prevention strategy. Okay, so if we're going to do a warm-up with a runner, we want to think about how we're going to do this. And I think we need to be realistic and try and keep it short and simple. A lot of us don't have a great deal of time in our days for exercise and running. We don't want to end up doing a 20-minute, half an hour warm-up before every single run. So I keep it quite short and quite simple and try and vary it based on individual need and training type. So, for example, if I'm going out for a really easy run, very low intensity, actually I might do a very short warm-up or even just use the first half a mile of running as my warm-up for it because I'm easing into a quite easy session. However, if I'm going to do a tougher session, I'm doing some interval running or I'm doing a race over a shorter distance, I really want to prepare my body for that. So I'm going to spend more time warming up, preparing my body for that so I feel ready to challenge myself a little bit harder. So do think about the different training types, a bit more of a diligent, organized warm-up for the tougher, high-intensity sessions. Now, broadly speaking, there are usually going to be 4 things that I will tend to think about in a warm-up and try and link them back to the individual and what their needs are. So I might think about range of movement as one option. And in general, again, keep it simple. Get the stiff bits moving. Now, this doesn't have to be doing long static stretches, because we know that they can have a negative effect on power output, but it can just be simple dynamic stretches, just gently getting the stiff areas moving to loosen things off to prepare someone for running. Now, this can be particularly important if you're working with someone with tendinopathy. We know that that can lead the tendon to feel quite stiff, and that there's a warm-up effect with exercise and movement which helps loosen things off. So why not get them working the area gently, just getting things moving to try and overcome that stiffness, so they're going to be more comfortable when they start their run. So that's often the first port of call: get the stiff bits moving, loosen things off with some dynamic movements rather than some static stretches. Second, we might do some balance work, and this again depends on individual needs. So if you've assessed someone and identified they struggle with single leg balance or single leg squat movements, why not get them to spend some time practicing this as part of their warm-up to improve their balance, similar to what's been done successfully in the FIFA 11 Plus. So you can include that in there if you feel it's a rehab need for them. And once we've got things moving, maybe we've practiced some balance and some dynamic balance, then I would often go on to something more plyometric. So we're not going straight into plyometric exercises, we're getting the body ready for it and then introducing some plyometrics. Again, it can be relatively short. And there was a nice study done fairly recently by Wei et al. In 2020 that actually found that a plyometric warm-up helped to improve running economy. And I think part of what makes it effective is that plyometric exercises increase the stiffness in the lower limb, so they can help us get better use out of elastic energy as we run. And I believe when we look at that study, relatively small study, the improvements in running economy range from between 4 and 9%, which is quite a good acute improvement from these exercises. And the exercises they included in there weren't hugely time consuming and were things a lot of runners can do. So they had people doing 2 sets of 8 of 3 different exercises: squat jumps, scissor jumps, and double leg bounds. So not a huge amount of repetitions, but really bringing in some simple plyometric exercises to help prepare for running and maybe have this positive knock-on effect for running economy. Now, when I get runners to do plyometrics as part of their pre-run warm-up, I try and make sure that they're not going to be provocative for them, and I've tried to prepare them for that first, as I said, by loosening up, bit of balance work, but also try and get them to perhaps start a little bit easier in their first set of plyometrics and ramp that intensity up a little bit, so that we can build them towards using them for real good power generating exercises, really focusing on rapid movements with short ground contact times. So in this way, we could use them in the warm-up, but also as a way to help a runner to restore power as part of their rehab. Now, this is particularly important in people who are telling you perhaps they struggle with their faster workouts. They're struggling to produce force at speed. So including some form of plyometrics in there can be really helpful. And it could include things like bounding, like hopping, like strides. There's a number of different things you can include in there. Relatively small amount of reps. I think the 2 sets of 8 used in the study is a nice example. So we're not creating fatigue, we're helping getting them fired up and ready for their running. And then a final thought that we may include as well, again depends on individual need, is perhaps some form of isometric exercise. Now, I might include this for someone if they're finding that some isometrics help to reduce pain. Perhaps they help to reduce pain and stiffness in a tendon issue they're having. If that's something we're finding in clinic when we're testing it, we may well then include it as part of their warm-up. Again, we don't want this warm-up to be fatiguing, so we would get them working at a level that helps to reduce their symptoms without causing sensations of lots of muscle fatigue. So it would take a little bit of experimentation with them, perhaps looking at holds of perhaps 20 to 40 seconds, something like that, 4 or 5 reps, finding one exercise that's effective for them as part of their warm-up. But it would depend on their response to it and again, depends on individual need. So a few different options there. Perhaps try and loosen up the areas that are stiff by working on range of movement. Do some balance work if that's indicated. Include some plyometrics to help power and help prepare them for running. And then think about other exercise options like isometrics to help address pain if that's effective for them. Now, I think if we can try and reason this through with someone, it can be really helpful. So if we think of a case of a runner, let's talk about my proximal hamstring tendinopathy, for example. I can tell you a little bit about the warm-up that I was using for that when it was more symptomatic. Now, my running style is such that I don't have a great deal of hip extension, and I'm quite tight through my hip flexors. And we know there's some evidence that increased tightness through hip flexors can actually increase the stress on the hamstring. I also tended to overstride with quite a low step rate. So these are things we could potentially see if we could address within my warm-up. So when I'm working on range of movement, I would often start by doing some walking lunges just to get some dynamic movement going to stretch those hip flexors a little bit, give me a little bit more hip extension range available to me pre-run. I'm also someone who gets a bit stiff through the mid-back, through the thoracic spine, so I do a lot of rotation and extension work there just to loosen things up a little bit there. My balance is generally fairly good, so I don't tend to work on that. But in my plyometrics, I would do some bounding to try and see if I can improve my propulsion and get a bit more hip extension there. And some quick feet plyometric work, really rapidly trying to do jogging on the spot and similar exercises like ladder workouts, get that really rapid foot contact to help prepare me for trying to increase my step rate if I'm using that as a cue during running. And when my hamstring pain was still quite irritable, I found some isometric hamstring stuff effective. Simple things, just standing up and digging my heel back into a wall or a curb to get that hamstring working was quite a nice way of reducing some of that hamstring pain pre-run. So hopefully you can see there's a kind of reasoning process behind why we might choose these exercises for me as an individual. It's still going to take 5-6 minutes, so it's not going to be very long. It's still fairly simple, and it's realistic then for someone to include in their program. So I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview of warm-ups for runners. I think we need to recognize that they're probably not going to be brilliantly effective on their own for reducing injury incidence, but they do have a role for preparing us for our sport, maybe helping our running economy. But also that it's okay in some situations for them to be quite short, quite simple, even just using that first half a mile of the run during an easy session as the warm-up in itself, and perhaps using something a bit more detailed, a bit more careful when we're using those higher intensity sessions. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. Again, we'll point out we've got a link there to our free webinar series on lateral hip pain. There's also ones on Achilles tendinopathy and lower back pain in athletes that I've linked to there for you. Do check those out. And I'd like to hear from you. What warm-ups do you find effective? Are there things that you would include that I've not talked about here? Do you have any questions about this particular topic? Do let us know in the comments, and I look forward to speaking to you again soon. Bye for now.